April 24, 2018. A quiet Tuesday morning in Citrus Heights, California, a peaceful Sacramento suburb. Retirees are walking their dogs. People are heading to work. The sun is shining. In a modest ranch-style home on Canyon Oak Drive, a 72-year-old man is probably eating breakfast, maybe reading the newspaper. Just another retired grandfather living out his golden years in suburban comfort. His name is Joseph James DeAngelo, and in approximately 1 hour, his 44-year secret is about to end. Unmarked police vehicles surround the neighborhood. FBI agents, Sacramento Sheriff's Department, investigators who have spent decades chasing a ghost. They've been watching this house for days, collecting evidence from his trash, following his every move. At 3:00 p.m. they move in. Joseph DeAngelo walks out of his garage. He sees the officers. And according to witnesses, he simply says, "I have a roast in the oven," not "there must be a mistake," not "what's this about," just, "I have a roast in the oven." Because somewhere deep inside, Joseph James DeAngelo knew this day would come. He'd been waiting for it since 1974. For over 4 decades, Joseph DeAngelo was one of the most prolific criminals in American history. He terrorized California under multiple names: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. Crime writer Michelle McNamara gave him the name that would stick, the Golden State Killer, and for 44 years he got away with it. He lived among us, a neighbor, a coworker, a former police officer, until DNA technology finally caught up. This is the story of how Joseph DeAngelo committed some of the most calculated crimes in California history, how he evaded the largest manhunt in state history, and how a revolutionary DNA technology, genetic genealogy, finally brought him to justice. This is the story of the Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8, 1945 in Bath, New York. His father, Joseph S.R., was a U.S. Army sergeant. His mother, Kathleen, raised 4 children, Joseph, and his siblings Constance, John, and Rebecca. On the surface, an unremarkable American military family. But according to later accounts from family members, there were dark undercurrents. When Joseph was young, the family was stationed at a U.S. Air Force base in West Germany. According to relatives, young Joseph witnessed a traumatic event there, his sister Constance being assaulted by 2 airmen. Whether this is true, and whether it affected Joseph's later behavior, remains a subject of debate among psychologists. What we do know is that Joseph's sister, Rebecca, later stated their father was abusive, that Joseph grew up in an environment where violence was normalized. By his teenage years, Joseph DeAngelo was showing signs that something wasn't right. According to prosecutors, he committed burglaries as a teenager. He stole mail. And perhaps most disturbing, he harmed animals. These are classic warning signs of what criminologists call the homicidal triad, behaviors in childhood that often predict violent behavior in adulthood. But in 1960s suburban California, no one was looking for warning signs. Joseph graduated from Folsom High School in 1964. He was unremarkable, average student, played baseball, ordinary kid. He joined the U.S. Navy and served during the Vietnam War era. After his service, he attended Sierra College, then transferred to Sacramento State University, where he studied criminal justice. Criminal justice. The man who would become California's most notorious criminal was literally studying how to catch criminals. In 1973, Joseph DeAngelo became a police officer with the Exeter Police Department in Tulare County, California. The same year, he married Sharon Marie Huddle, a student he'd met at Sierra College. Sharon was, by all accounts, a decent person, an attorney who would build a respectable career. She had no idea who she was marrying. They would have 3 daughters together. They would build a suburban life together. And for 45 years, Sharon would have no idea that her husband was the Golden State Killer. As a police officer in Exeter, Joseph DeAngelo learned things that would later make him nearly impossible to catch. He learned how police respond to calls, how they investigate crimes, how evidence is collected and analyzed, what mistakes criminals make that get them caught. He was studying, preparing, learning his craft from the inside. In April 1974, a series of strange burglaries began in Visalia, California, the town where DeAngelo worked as a police officer. Over the next year, more than 120 homes were burglarized. But these weren't normal burglaries. Very little was stolen, sometimes just small personal items. Coins, single earrings, photographs. The burglar would ransack homes, tearing through drawers and closets, leaving everything in disarray. It seemed less about theft and more about something else: violation, control, psychological terror. Investigators called him the Visalia Ransacker. What made these burglaries particularly disturbing was the pattern. The ransacker would often enter homes while families slept. He would move through the house silently. Sometimes he would spend hours inside. Residents reported feeling watched, stalked. Some found disturbing evidence that someone had been in their yard, looking through windows. The Visalia Ransacker was evolving, learning, perfecting his technique. On December 10, 1975, the Visalia Ransacker attempted to kidnap a 16-year-old girl from her home. Her father, Claude Snelling, a journalism professor, heard the commotion and confronted the masked intruder. The intruder shot him twice. Claude Snelling died protecting his daughter. The Visalia Ransacker had escalated to taking a life, but police had no suspects. No witnesses could identify him. The investigation went nowhere. And then, suddenly, the Visalia Ransacker vanished. In June 1976, a new nightmare began in Sacramento, about 200 miles north of Visalia. A masked man began breaking into homes in the middle of the night. He would target homes where couples or women lived alone. He would enter silently, waking victims by shining a flashlight in their faces. What followed established a pattern that would terrorize Sacramento for 3 years. The attacker was methodical, prepared. He brought shoelaces to bind his victims. He would separate couples, threatening terrible consequences if they didn't comply. Victims described his voice, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a high-pitched, almost childlike voice, as if he was disguising it. He would spend hours in victims' homes. He would take breaks to eat food from their refrigerators, rummage through personal items. Between 1976 and 1979, the East Area Rapist attacked over 50 victims across Sacramento, Contra Costa County, and surrounding areas. The attacks followed a pattern but with terrifying variations. He was learning, adapting, becoming more sophisticated. He would call victims weeks or even months later, taunting them, proving he was still watching, still in control. Sacramento was paralyzed with fear. Women were terrified to sleep in their own homes. Neighborhoods organized watch groups. Gun sales skyrocketed, but nothing stopped him. Police formed special task forces. They conducted massive investigations. They followed hundreds of leads, but the East Area Rapist seemed to always be one step ahead. He knew how to avoid leaving evidence. He wore gloves. He was careful not to leave fingerprints. He seemed to understand exactly how police investigations worked, because, of course, he did. Joseph DeAngelo was still a police officer during this time. In July 1979, Joseph DeAngelo's law enforcement career ended abruptly. He was caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a pay-and-save store in Auburn, California. A hammer and dog repellent. the same items that could be used to break into homes and neutralize guard dogs. DeAngelo was fired from the Auburn Police Department. His career in law enforcement was over, and his crimes were about to escalate even further. In October 1979, the attacks shifted to Southern California, and they became deadly. A couple in Goleta, California, were attacked in their home. Both were killed. It was the same pattern, entry in the middle of the night, binding victims, methodical approach. But now the attacker was taking lives. Over the next 7 years, the original Night Stalker, as he was called in Southern California, would be linked to 10 more homicides in Ventura, Orange, and Santa Barbara counties. For years, law enforcement didn't realize the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, and the original Night Stalker were the same person. The crimes happened in different jurisdictions, different counties, different regions of a very large state. The technology didn't exist yet to connect them. DNA analysis was in its infancy. Different police departments didn't communicate effectively. It was assumed these were different criminals with similar methods, but they were all Joseph DeAngelo. In May 1986, Joseph DeAngelo took his final confirmed victim, and then he stopped, just stopped. For decades, investigators would wonder, why did he move away? Go to prison for an unrelated crime, die, become disabled. The truth, as we now know, is simpler and more chilling. He decided he was done. He'd satisfied whatever dark need drove him. He'd gotten away with it, and now it was time to fade back into normal life. Joseph DeAngelo went to work. He got a job with a supermarket distribution warehouse. He raised his 3 daughters. He went to family gatherings. He fixed things around the house. He lived in the same house in Citrus Heights for decades. His neighbors described him as odd, a bit grumpy, obsessed with his lawn, but otherwise unremarkable. No one suspected that the angry old man yelling about property lines was one of the most prolific criminals in American history. While Joseph DeAngelo was living his quiet suburban life, law enforcement never gave up. Detectives who'd worked the original cases couldn't let go. They reviewed files. They followed new leads. They hoped for a breakthrough. In 2001, DNA technology provided the first major breakthrough. Analysts were able to confirm that DNA from East Area Rapist crime scenes in Northern California matched DNA from original Night Stalker crime scenes in Southern California. They weren't different criminals. They were the same person. This was huge. It meant California was dealing with one of the most prolific offenders in state history. Someone who'd terrorized multiple regions across 12 years. In the 2010s, crime writer Michelle McNamara became obsessed with the case. She spent years researching, interviewing victims and investigators, compiling information that had been scattered across dozens of jurisdictions. She gave the criminal a new name, the Golden State Killer. The name stuck. It unified the Visalia Ransacker, East Area Rapist, and original Night Stalker cases under one identity. It brought national attention to a case that had largely been forgotten outside California. Michelle McNamara wrote a book about the case, I'll Be Gone in the Dark. Tragically, she died in 2016 before completing it. The book was finished by her researchers and published posthumously in 2018. In the book's epilogue, McNamara wrote a message to the Golden State Killer. One day soon, you'll hear a car pull up to your curb, an engine cut out. You'll hear footsteps coming up your front walk. This is how it ends for you. She was right. Just months after her book was published, those footsteps would come. If Michelle McNamara was the Golden State Killer's chronicler, Paul Holes was his hunter. Holes was a cold case investigator with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office. He'd been working the Golden State Killer case since the 1990s. It became his obsession. Holes preserved DNA evidence from old crime scenes. He compared samples. He built timelines. He interviewed survivors. He coordinated with investigators across multiple jurisdictions. And crucially, Paul Holes stayed current with advances in DNA technology. He understood that the science was evolving rapidly, and he believed that eventually that science would catch the Golden State Killer. In 2017, a new technology was being used to solve cold cases: genetic genealogy. It worked like this. Investigators would take DNA from a crime scene and upload it to public genealogy databases, websites where people voluntarily share their DNA to find relatives and learn about their ancestry. Sites like GEDmatch and FamilyTree DNA. The DNA wouldn't match the criminal directly, but it might match distant cousins, second cousins, third cousins, people who shared a common ancestor. From there, investigators would build family trees. They'd work backward from those distant cousins, identifying common ancestors, then working forward through generations to find individuals who fit the age, location, and description of the suspect. It was painstaking work. It could take months, but it worked. In February 2018, Paul Holes and forensic genealogist Barbara Rae-Venter took DNA from Golden State Killer crime scenes and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database. They got matches. Distant relatives who'd voluntarily uploaded their DNA to find family connections. Rae-Venter began building family trees. She identified common ancestors from the 1800s. Then she traced those family lines forward through marriage records, birth certificates, census data, obituaries. The work was exhausting. Dead ends everywhere. People who moved, changed names, died without records, but slowly, methodically, Rae-Venter narrowed the field. By April 2018, she had a list of potential suspects. One name stood out: Joseph James DeAngelo. Age, 72. Right age range for someone who committed crimes in the 1970s and 80s. Location: living in Citrus Heights, Sacramento area. Right region for the East Area Rapist attacks. Background: former police officer. Would explain his knowledge of investigation techniques. It fit, almost too perfectly. Investigators couldn't just arrest Joseph DeAngelo based on genetic genealogy. The technology was new. Its legal standing was uncertain. They needed direct DNA evidence, so they put him under surveillance. For days, teams watched his house, followed his movements, waited for him to discard something they could test for DNA. On April 20th, 2018, DeAngelo threw away a tissue while getting out of his car. Investigators collected it. DNA analysts ran tests. They compared the DNA from the tissue to DNA from Golden State Killer crime scenes. It matched. After 44 years, after 13 murders, after over 50 rapes, after 120-plus burglaries, after terrorizing entire communities, after evading the largest manhunt in California history, they had him. On April 24, 2018, at 3:00 p.m., law enforcement moved in. Joseph DeAngelo was arrested outside his Citrus Heights home without incident. According to reports, he seemed calm, almost resigned. He asked about his roast in the oven. He cooperated with officers. Within hours, the news broke. The Golden State Killer had been caught. After 4 decades, one of America's most notorious criminals was finally in custody. The arrest made headlines worldwide. Survivors wept with relief. Families of victims felt vindication. Law enforcement celebrated a victory decades in the making. But for some people, the news brought a different kind of shock, a different kind of horror, because they knew Joseph DeAngelo personally. Sharon Huddle, DeAngelo's wife of 45 years, filed for divorce immediately. she released a statement saying she'd had no idea, that the arrest had destroyed her world, that she'd been living with a stranger all those years. His 3 daughters were devastated. The man who'd been their father, who'd helped with homework, attended school events, walked them down the aisle, was one of the most notorious criminals in American history. Neighbors were shocked. They'd lived next to Joseph DeAngelo for years. They'd had conversations with him, argued about property lines, borrowed tools. Some remembered him as angry and odd, but no one suspected this. How could they? Joseph DeAngelo was just another retired, grumpy old man. There was nothing to indicate the monster he'd been decades earlier. And that's perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this case. The Golden State Killer didn't look like a monster. He looked like everyone else. After DeAngelo's arrest, prosecutors faced an enormous challenge. How do you prosecute a case involving crimes from 44 years earlier, where witnesses' memories have faded, where evidence has degraded, where some victims have passed away? The lead prosecutor was Thien Ho, a homicide attorney with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. In November 2025, Ho published a book about the case, The People vs. The Golden State Killer. In it, he describes the complexity of coordinating across multiple jurisdictions: Sacramento, Contra Costa, Santa Barbara, Ventura, Orange, and Tulare counties. Each jurisdiction wanted justice for their victims. Each had their own evidence, their own cases, but they all agreed Joseph DeAngelo must face consequences for all his crimes. There was a problem. Due to California's statute of limitations, DeAngelo couldn't be charged with most of the rapes he'd committed in the 1970s. Too much time had passed. He could only be charged with the murders, and with kidnapping and robbery counts related to those murders. This meant survivors of his attacks would never see him prosecuted for what he'd done to them. It was a bitter pill. But prosecutors worked to include survivor testimony in the sentencing phase, giving victims a voice even if formal charges couldn't be filed. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo appeared in court via video link. He was 74 years old, frail, in a wheelchair. A far cry from the athletic young police officer who'd terrorized California decades earlier. He pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. As part of his plea deal, he also admitted to numerous rapes and burglaries that he couldn't be formally charged with due to statute of limitations. Why did DeAngelo plead guilty? The plea deal spared him the death penalty. In exchange for admitting to all his crimes, he would receive life imprisonment without possibility of parole instead of facing execution. For many victims and their families, this was controversial. Some believed DeAngelo deserved the death penalty. Others were relieved they wouldn't have to endure a lengthy trial, reliving trauma in excruciating detail. The sentencing hearing lasted for days. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, it was held in a ballroom at Sacramento State University to allow for social distancing. Over 50 survivors and family members gave victim impact statements. They stood before Joseph DeAngelo, who sat silently, showing little emotion, and described how his crimes had destroyed their lives. One survivor, Jane Carson Sandler, who'd been attacked in 1976, spoke directly to DeAngelo. She described how his attack had stolen her sense of safety, how she'd lived in fear for decades, how she'd finally found the courage to reclaim her life. She said, "I've waited 44 years for this moment. You are finally going to prison, and that's where you'll die." Another survivor, Chris Pedretti, who'd been attacked in 1976 at age 15, spoke about the life she'd lost, the fear that had defined her existence, the relationships that had been damaged, the decades stolen by trauma. She said to DeAngelo, "Your evil didn't win. We won." Family members of murder victims spoke about loved ones who'd never seen justice, about growing up without mothers, fathers, siblings, about decades of wondering if the killer would ever be caught. After days of victim impact statements, Joseph DeAngelo was given a chance to speak. His statement was brief. 3 sentences. "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." 3 sentences. After 13 murders, after over 50 rapes, after 120-plus burglaries, after 44 years of silence, after destroying countless lives. 3 sentences. Many in the courtroom felt it was inadequate, hollow, an empty gesture from a man who'd shown no remorse for decades. Judge Michael Bowman agreed. Before sentencing, he said, "The defendant deserves no mercy." Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. 11 consecutive life sentences, plus 8 additional life sentences to run concurrently. He will die in prison. Judge Bowman addressed DeAngelo directly. "I fully expected that in your statement you would show empathy. You showed not an ounce. What you truly are is a cold, heart, hollow person." Joseph DeAngelo was transferred to California State Prison, Corcoran, where he's held in protective custody. He's now 79 years old, reportedly in poor health, spending his final years in a cell, far from the suburban comfort he enjoyed for decades. For survivors and victims' families, it's not perfect justice. Nothing can undo the harm he caused. Nothing can give back the years lost to fear and trauma. But it's something. It's accountability. It's closure. It's knowing that the monster who haunted California for so long will never walk free again. The Golden State Killer case didn't just solve one of America's most notorious crime sprees. It revolutionized how law enforcement solves cold cases. Since DeAngelo's arrest in 2018, genetic genealogy has been used to solve over 360 cold cases across the United States. Murders that went unsolved for decades are suddenly being cracked. The technique is powerful. It doesn't require the suspect's DNA to be in a law enforcement database. It only requires that some distant relative, a third cousin, a fourth cousin, uploaded their DNA to a public genealogy website. And millions of people have done exactly that. Sites like GEDmatch and FamilyTree DNA contain DNA from millions of users. According to some estimates, about 60% of Americans of European descent can now be identified through genetic genealogy, even if they've never taken a DNA test themselves. But the technique raises serious privacy questions. When you upload your DNA to a genealogy website, you're not just sharing your own genetic information. You're potentially exposing your entire extended family to law enforcement searches. Is that ethical? Is it legal? Should law enforcement be able to search public databases without a warrant? Privacy advocates argue that genetic genealogy amounts to a genetic stop and frisk, allowing police to investigate people who have never committed crimes, simply because they're related to someone who did. Law enforcement and victim advocates counter that the databases are public. People voluntarily shared their DNA. And the technique only identifies suspects. Actual arrest requires traditional DNA evidence, warrants, and due process. The debate continues. Several states have passed laws regulating how genetic genealogy can be used, but the technology is here to stay. But let's be clear, this story isn't about technology. It's about the people whose lives Joseph DeAngelo destroyed. 13 murder victims, over 50 survivors of assault, countless families whose sense of safety was shattered. Entire communities that lived in fear for years. The murder victims, Claude Snelling, Brian and Katie Magyar, Charlene and Lyman Smith, Patris and Keith Harrington, Manuela Whitthune, Deborah Alexandra Manning, Cherie Domingo and Gregory Sanchez, Janelle Cruz. These weren't just names in a case file. They were people, students, professionals, parents. They had futures that Joseph DeAngelo stole. The survivors who testified at DeAngelo's sentencing showed remarkable courage. Many had lived with trauma for over 40 years. Some had never spoken publicly about what happened to them. Standing in that courtroom, facing their attacker, they reclaimed power he'd taken from them decades earlier. One survivor, Phyllis Henneman, was diagnosed with cancer and couldn't attend the initial hearing. Other victims stood in tribute to her. She made it to the sentencing, despite her illness, to see DeAngelo held accountable. She died 3 months later. Her family started a nonprofit in her honor, Phyllis's Promise, supporting survivors of violent crime. That's the real legacy of this case, not the technology, not the investigation. The strength of survivors who refused to let trauma define them. The Golden State Killer case taught law enforcement critical lessons. First, preserve evidence. In the 1970s, DNA analysis didn't exist, but investigators carefully preserved biological evidence anyway. Decades later, that evidence solved the case. Second, never give up. Detectives worked this case for 44 years. Many investigators retired without seeing it solved, but they kept the files active. They kept pushing, and eventually that persistence paid off. Third, embrace new technology. If Paul Holes and his colleagues had stuck with traditional DNA database searches, DeAngelo would never have been caught. He'd never been arrested for a felony, so his DNA wasn't in CODIS, the law enforcement DNA database. But genetic genealogy didn't require that. It only required distant relatives in public databases. And that made all the difference. One question haunts many people. Could another Golden State Killer be operating right now? The answer is probably not in the same way. Modern technology makes it almost impossible to commit crimes at that scale without being caught. DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, cell phone tracking, surveillance cameras everywhere. Digital footprints. Joseph DeAngelo operated in an analog world. He could move through neighborhoods without being recorded. He could make phone calls without being traced. He could disappear into darkness without a digital trail. That world doesn't exist anymore. But the case reminds us that monsters don't always look like monsters. That evil can hide behind ordinary faces. That the person next to you could be living a life you can't imagine. Joseph James DeAngelo is currently incarcerated at California State Prison, Corcoran. He's 79 years old, in protective custody because even in prison, other inmates would likely harm him if given the chance. He receives very few visitors. His ex-wife and daughters have reportedly cut all contact. He's alone with the consequences of his actions. According to reports, he's in poor health. The strong, athletic young man who terrorized California in the 1970s and 80s is now a frail old man spending his final years in a cell. He'll die in prison, and when he does, few will mourn. Remember Michelle McNamara's words, the message she wrote to the Golden State Killer in her book. One day soon, you'll hear a car pull up to your curb, an engine cut out. You'll hear footsteps coming up your front walk. This is how it ends for you. She was right. She died before seeing it happen, but she was right. The footsteps came, the arrest happened. And it ended exactly as she predicted. Michelle McNamara's contribution to this case cannot be overstated. Her research brought national attention to a case that had been largely forgotten. Her book kept investigators motivated. Her insights helped shape the narrative. She didn't live to see Joseph DeAngelo arrested, but in many ways she made it possible. The Golden State Killer case is, ultimately, a story about persistence. Survivors who refused to let trauma win, families who never stopped seeking justice, investigators who worked the case for decades, a crime writer who made it her life's work to identify a monster, and new technology that finally provided the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. It took 44 years, 4 decades, an entire generation, but justice came, not because Joseph DeAngelo confessed, not because he made an obvious mistake, but because investigators preserved evidence, embraced new technology, and never gave up. As we close this story, let's return to where it should always center: the victims. Claude Snelling, shot protecting his daughter; Brian Magyar and Katie Magyar, a young couple killed while walking their dog; Charlene Smith and Lyman Smith, newlyweds murdered in their home; Patrice Harrington and Keith Harrington, another young couple just starting their lives; Manuela Whitthune, killed 3 days after Christmas; Deborah Alexandra Manning, only 35 years old; Cherie Domingo and Gregory Sanchez, their lives cut short; Janelle Cruz, just 18 years old, the last known victim; 13 people, 13 lives, 13 families forever changed, and over 50 survivors who carried trauma for decades, who fought to reclaim their lives, who stood in that courtroom and faced their attacker. They are the heroes of this story, not the investigators, not the technology, them. If there's one lesson from the Golden State Killer case, it's this: time doesn't heal all wounds, but it can bring justice. 44 years is a long time to wait. Many victims never lived to see DeAngelo arrested. Some survivors carried their trauma to the grave, never knowing if the person who hurt them would face consequences. But for those who survived long enough to see April 24th, 2018, to see Joseph DeAngelo arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced, there was finally closure. The technology that caught him, genetic genealogy, is now being used to solve cold cases across the country. Families who thought they'd never have answers are getting phone calls from detectives. Cases that seemed impossible to solve are being cracked. Joseph DeAngelo's arrest didn't just close one case. It opened a door to solving hundreds more. The Golden State Killer terrorized California for over a decade. He evaded capture for 44 years. He lived a comfortable suburban life while his victims lived with trauma. But in the end, justice caught up. Not because he confessed, not because he felt remorse, but because dedicated investigators never gave up, because technology evolved, because society decided that no one, no matter how long they hide, is beyond accountability. This has been the story of the Golden State Killer, not to glorify a criminal, but to honor the victims, celebrate the survivors, and remind ourselves that even after 44 years, justice can still prevail. Thank you for watching. Technology changes, science evolves, and the criminals who thought they got away are running out of places to hide.